It's always the same hour. The world is silent, the streets are empty, and the only sound is the hum of your own thoughts. 3 a.m. Some people call it the witching hour, others the dead of night. But for me, and for the people whose stories I'm about to share, it's the hour when the world feels thin, when the ordinary rules of reality seem to loosen, and when a cry for help can mean something far more than it seems. I never used to believe in omens. I thought the world was a place of cause and effect, of logic and reason. But that was before I started collecting these stories, before I realized how many people from all walks of life have heard something at 3 a.m. that changed them forever. Some of these stories are about strangers, some about family, and some about the things that live in the spaces between. But all of them begin with a cry for help and a choice, to answer or to pretend you never heard it. The first story comes from a woman named Claire. She grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are hard to keep. She was 17 the first time she heard it. A voice, thin and desperate, calling her name from outside her window. It was late, and she'd been lying awake, unable to sleep, when she heard the first faint, trembling, "Claire, help me." At first, she thought it was a dream. But the voice came again, closer this time, and unmistakably real. She got out of bed, heart pounding, and crept to the window. The street outside was empty, bathed in the yellow glow of a single street lamp. She pressed her face to the glass, searching for movement, but saw nothing. The voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. "Claire, please." She wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but something in her gut told her not to. Instead, she backed away from the window, locked her bedroom door, and crawled under the covers, shivering. The next morning, she told her mother what had happened. Her mother's face went pale, and she told Claire a story she'd never heard before. Years ago, when her mother was a teenager, she'd heard the same voice, at the same hour, calling her name from outside. She'd gone to the window, just as Claire had, but she'd opened it, stepped outside, and found nothing but the cold night air. For weeks afterward, she'd felt watched, uneasy, as if something had followed her back inside. She warned Claire never to answer a cry for help at 3 a.m., no matter how real it sounded. Claire never heard the voice again, but she never forgot it. Years later, when she had a daughter of her own, she found herself repeating the same warning, passing down a fear that had no explanation, only a history. The second story is from a man named David. He was a paramedic, used to late nights and early mornings, to the sound of sirens and the sight of suffering. But there was one call he never forgot. It was a quiet night, the kind where the city seemed to be holding its breath. At 2:58 a.m., the radio crackled to life. A woman screaming for help, her voice high and panicked. The dispatcher tried to get her address, but the call was full of static. The woman's words breaking up, but always the same. "Help me. Please, he's here, he's here." David and his partner raced to the location, a run-down apartment building on the edge of town. When they arrived, the building was dark, the front door ajar. They climbed the stairs, following the sound of sobbing, until they reached apartment 3B. The door was locked, but they could hear the woman inside crying, begging for help. They called the police, who arrived minutes later and broke down the door. Inside, they found the woman huddled in a corner, shaking, her eyes wide with terror. She kept repeating, "He was here. He was here." But there was no one else in the apartment. The police searched the building, but found nothing. David tried to comfort her, but she wouldn't let anyone touch her. She just kept staring at the window, as if expecting someone or something to come back. After that night, David started to notice a pattern. Every few months, they'd get a call at 3 a.m., always from the same building, always from a different apartment. The details changed, but the fear was always the same. He started to wonder if the building itself was haunted, or if something darker was at work. He never found out, but he never forgot the look in that woman's eyes, or the way the air felt heavy and wrong in that apartment. The third story is my own. I was in college, living in a cheap apartment with thin walls and creaky floors. I'd been up late studying, the clock ticking past 3 a.m. when I heard it, a voice, muffled and distant, calling for help. At first I thought it was coming from the street, but as I listened, I realized it was coming from the apartment next door. I hesitated. I didn't know my neighbors well, but I knew the woman who lived there was quiet, kept to herself. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening. The voice came again, softer now, almost a whisper. "Please, help me." I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but something made me pause. The voice didn't sound quite right. It was too calm, too measured, as if it was being recited from memory. I knocked on the wall, hoping for a response. Silence. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I went to the hallway, knocked on her door. No answer. I stood there, heart racing, unsure what to do. Finally, I called the police, explained what I'd heard. They arrived quickly, checked the apartment, but found nothing. The woman wasn't home. She'd left town for the weekend. Her apartment empty. I never heard the voice again, but for weeks afterward, I felt uneasy in my own home. I started to wonder if the voice had been real or if I'd imagined it. But I know what I heard, and I know that sometimes a cry for help at 3 a.m. isn't what it seems. There's a strange kind of loneliness that settles in at 3 a.m., a hush that feels both protective and threatening. It's the hour when the world is at its most vulnerable, when the boundaries between waking and dreaming blur, and when the smallest sound can feel like a summons. For some, it's the time when old memories surface, unbidden and sharp. For others, it's when the past comes knocking, disguised as a plea for help. The fourth story comes from a man named Luis, who grew up in a sprawling, crumbling house on the outskirts of a city that never quite felt like home. He was the youngest of 5, and by the time he was old enough to remember, his siblings had all moved out, leaving him alone with his parents and the echo of their absence. The house was full of empty rooms, each one holding its own secrets, its own shadows. Luis remembers the first time he heard the crying. He was 10, lying awake in his bed, the moonlight painting strange shapes on the ceiling. At first he thought it was his mother, but the sound was too small, too childlike. It came from the far end of the hallway, from the old nursery that hadn't been used in years. The crying was soft, almost apologetic, as if whoever was making it didn't want to be heard. He got up, padded down the hallway, and stood outside the nursery door. The crying stopped as soon as he touched the doorknob. He opened the door, expecting to find nothing but dust and forgotten toys, but the room was empty, the air cold and still. He went back to bed, convinced he'd imagined it. But the crying came again the next night, and the night after that. Always at 3 a.m., always from the nursery. He told his parents, but they brushed it off, said it was just the house settling, or the wind in the eaves. But Luis knew the difference. He started to dread the hour, lying awake, counting the minutes until the crying began. One night, he decided to stay awake, to confront whatever was making the sound. He sat in the hallway, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the nursery door. At exactly 3 a.m., the crying started, louder this time, more insistent. He stood up, hands shaking, and opened the door. The room was empty, but the crying continued, echoing around him, filling the space. He felt a cold hand brush his arm, and the crying stopped. After that night, the crying never came again. But Luis never forgot the feeling of that cold hand, or the sense that something in the house had been waiting for him to listen, The fifth story is from a nurse named Evelyn, who worked the night shift at a hospice. She was used to the quiet, to the slow rhythm of breathing machines and the soft shuffle of slippers on linoleum. But there was one patient she could never forget, a woman named Mrs. Callahan, who was dying of cancer. Mrs. Callahan was kind, always smiling, always asking about Evelyn's family. But as her illness progressed, she became more withdrawn, her eyes fixed on the window, as if watching for something only she could see. One night, around 3 a.m., Evelyn was making her rounds when she heard Mrs. Callahan calling for help. The voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but urgent. Evelyn hurried to her room, expecting to find her in pain or distress. But Mrs. Callahan was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, staring at the corner of the room. "He's here," she whispered. "He's waiting for me." Evelyn looked, but saw nothing. She tried to comfort Mrs. Callahan, but the old woman just shook her head. "Don't you hear him?" she asked. "He's crying. He wants me to go with him." Evelyn stayed with her until dawn, holding her hand, listening to the silence. Mrs. Callahan died the next night, just after 3 a.m. Afterward, Evelyn asked the other nurses if they'd ever heard crying in the hospice at night. They all said the same thing. Sometimes, just before a patient passes, they hear a child crying, somewhere down the hall. No one ever finds the source. The sixth story is from a man named Marcus, who worked as a security guard at a shopping mall. The job was mostly boring. Long hours, empty corridors, the occasional drunk teenager trying to break into the arcade. But there was one night he would never forget. It was a Tuesday, the mall closed and silent, the only light coming from the emergency exit signs. Marcus was making his rounds when he heard it, a child's voice crying for help. At first he thought it was a recording, maybe a prank, but the voice was too real, too desperate. He followed the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The crying led him to the old toy store, long since closed, its windows covered in dust. The door was locked, but the crying continued, muffled but insistent. Marcus radioed for backup, but no one answered. He tried the door again, and this time it swung open. Inside, the store was empty, the shelves bare. The crying stopped as soon as he stepped inside. He searched the store but found nothing. As he turned to leave, he saw a small handprint on the inside of the glass, just at his eye level. The print was fresh, as if a child had pressed their hand against the window only moments before. Marcus quit his job a week later. He never told anyone what he'd seen, but he never forgot the sound of that child's voice, or the feeling that he'd missed something important, something that might have changed everything if only he'd arrived a little sooner. These stories are not unique. Every city, every town, every family has its own version. A cry for help at 3 a.m., a choice to answer or ignore, and the consequences that follow. Some people say it's just the mind playing tricks, the brain's way of processing fear and loneliness. Others believe it's something more, a warning, a test, or a plea from the other side. But whatever you believe, one thing is certain. A cry for help at 3 a.m. is never just a sound. It's a question, a challenge, a door that opens onto something unknown. And once you've heard it, you can never quite go back to the way things were before. There's a pattern to these stories, a rhythm that repeats itself across time and place. The hour is always late, the world is always quiet, and the voice is always just out of sight. Sometimes it's a whisper, sometimes a scream, but always a plea that cuts through the silence and demands to be heard. And always, there's a choice, to answer or to turn away. The seventh story comes from a woman named Priya, who grew up in a bustling city apartment, the kind where the walls are thin and privacy is a luxury. She was used to the sounds of neighbors, arguments, laughter, the thud of footsteps overhead. But one night, when she was 12, she woke to the sound of someone crying. It was a child's voice, high and broken, calling for help. At first, she thought it was coming from the hallway, maybe one of the neighbors' kids having a nightmare. But as she listened, she realized the voice was coming from inside her own apartment, from the living room. She got out of bed, heart pounding, and crept down the hallway. The crying grew louder, more desperate, until it seemed to fill the entire room. She flicked on the light, expecting to find her little brother, but the room was empty. The crying stopped instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. She stood there, frozen, until her mother came in, asking what she was doing awake. Priya tried to explain, but her mother just shook her head, told her it was a dream, and sent her back to bed. But the crying came again the next night, and the night after that. Always at 3 a.m., always from the living room. Priya started to dread the hour, lying awake, waiting for the sound. She tried to tell her parents, but they didn't believe her. Eventually, she stopped talking about it, stopped listening, and tried to pretend it wasn't real. Years later, after her family moved out, Priya learned that the previous tenants had lost a child in that apartment, a little boy who died suddenly, his parents away for the night. She wondered if the crying she'd heard was his, if he was still waiting for someone to come and help him. She never forgot the sound, or the feeling that she'd failed to answer a call that was meant for her. The 8th story is from a man named Greg, who worked as a night janitor at a high school. The job was lonely, the halls empty and echoing, the only company the hum of the vending machines and the occasional scurry of a mouse. But Greg liked the solitude, the sense of being the only person awake in a sleeping world. One night, as he was mopping the floors near the gym, he heard a voice over the intercom. It was faint, crackling with static, but unmistakably a child's voice, crying for help. Greg froze, mop in hand, listening as the voice repeated, "Please, someone, help me." He knew the intercom system was old, prone to glitches, but he'd never heard anything like this before. He made his way to the main office, where the intercom controls were located. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glow of the security monitors. He checked the system, but everything seemed normal. The voice continued, growing fainter, as if moving away down the hall. Greg followed the sound, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The voice led him to the old locker room, long since closed off after a flood had damaged the floors. The door was locked, but Greg could hear the crying inside, muffled and desperate. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He called the police, who arrived quickly and broke down the door. Inside they found nothing but dust and broken tiles. The crying had stopped, the room empty. The police shrugged it off, said it was probably a prank or a malfunction. But Greg knew what he'd heard. He quit his job a month later, unable to shake the feeling that he'd missed something important, that someone had needed his help, and he'd been too late. The 9th story is from a woman named Marisol, who worked as a live-in caregiver for an elderly woman named Mrs. Alvarez. The house was old, filled with the scent of lavender and mothballs, the walls lined with faded photographs. Mrs. Alvarez was kind but forgetful, her mind slipping in and out of the present. One night, Marisol was woken by the sound of crying. It was a child's voice, thin and wavering, calling for help. She got up, checked on Mrs. Alvarez, but found her sleeping peacefully. The crying continued, echoing through the house, always just out of reach. Marisol followed the sound, down the hallway, up the stairs, into the attic. The air was cold, the floorboards creaking under her feet. The crying grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to fill the entire space. She found an old trunk in the corner, covered in dust. The crying stopped as soon as she touched it. Inside the trunk, she found a collection of old toys, a faded photograph of a little boy, and a stack of letters written in a child's hand. The letters were addressed to Mrs. Alvarez, from her son, who had died young. Marisol realized the crying she'd heard was his, a voice reaching out across the years, still waiting for an answer. She placed the photograph on the mantel, lit a candle, and whispered a prayer for the boy. The crying never came again, but Marisol always felt a sense of peace in the house after that night, as if a restless spirit had finally been heard. These stories are not just about fear. They're about longing, about the need to be seen and heard, even in the darkest hours of the night. They're about the choices we make when faced with the unknown and the consequences that follow. Sometimes, a cry for help at 3 a.m. is a warning. Sometimes it's a plea for connection. And sometimes it's a reminder that we are never truly alone, even when the world is at its quietest. There's a certain vulnerability that comes with the night, a sense that the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At 3 a.m., the rules feel different. The familiar becomes strange, and the strange becomes possible. It's the hour when secrets slip through the cracks, when the past and present overlap, and when a single voice can change everything. The 10th story comes from a man named Ethan, who worked as a long-haul truck driver. He was used to the road, to the endless stretch of highway, the hum of tires on asphalt, and the loneliness that comes with being the only one awake for miles. But there was one night, somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, that he would never forget. It was just after 3 a.m., and Ethan was driving through a patch of fog so thick he could barely see the lines on the road. He was fighting sleep, his eyes heavy, when he heard a voice crackle through the CB radio. It was a child's voice, thin and trembling, calling for help. "Please, someone, help me. I'm lost." Ethan's heart pounded. He'd heard plenty of strange things on the radio before, pranks, ghost stories, even the occasional distress call. But this was different. The voice sounded real, terrified. He tried to respond, but the radio only hissed static. The voice came again, more desperate this time. "Please, I can't find my way home." He pulled over to the side of the road, headlights cutting through the fog, and tried the radio again. Nothing but static. He got out of the truck, the cold air biting at his skin, and listened. The night was silent, the fog pressing in on all sides. He called out, but there was no answer. Ethan waited for nearly an hour, hoping someone would come by, hoping the voice would return. But the road stayed empty, the fog unbroken. Eventually, he climbed back into his truck and drove on, the voice echoing in his mind. He never heard it again, but he never forgot the feeling of helplessness, the sense that someone out there had needed him, and he'd been powerless to help. The 11th story is from a woman named Julia, who worked as a night manager at a small hotel on the edge of town. The hotel was old, the kind of place that seemed to collect stories like dust. Julia was used to the odd guest, the occasional noise in the night, but there was one incident that still haunted her. It was a quiet night, the hotel nearly empty, when the phone at the front desk rang. Julia answered, expecting a guest with a simple request. Instead, she heard a child's voice crying, begging for help. "Please, can you come to room 214? I'm scared." Julia checked the register. Room 214 was unoccupied, the key still hanging on the board. She hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight and made her way up the stairs. The hallway was dark. The only sound was her footsteps on the worn carpet. She reached the door, heart pounding, and knocked. No answer. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was empty. The bed neatly made, the air cold and still. She checked the bathroom, the closet, even under the bed, but found nothing. As she turned to leave, she heard the crying again, this time coming from the hallway. She stepped outside, but the hallway was empty. Julia went back to the front desk, shaken. She checked the security cameras, but saw nothing unusual. The phone never rang again, but for weeks afterward, she avoided the second floor at night, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still waiting for help. The 12th story is from a man named Samir, who worked as a night shift orderly at a psychiatric hospital. The job was demanding, the patients unpredictable, the nights long and often unsettling. But there was one patient, a little girl named Lila, who stood out. Lila was 7, with wide, dark eyes and a habit of talking to people who weren't there. She rarely slept, and when she did, she often woke up screaming. One night, just after 3 a.m., Samir heard her crying for help. He rushed to her room, found her sitting up in bed, eyes fixed on the corner. "He's here," she whispered. "He wants me to go with him." Samir sat with her, trying to comfort her, but she wouldn't be soothed. She kept glancing at the corner, her eyes wide with terror. Eventually she fell asleep, clutching his hand. The next morning she was gone. The staff searched the hospital, but she was nowhere to be found. The only clue was a small handprint on the window just at her height, and the faint sound of crying that seemed to linger in the air. Samir never forgot Lila, or the feeling that he'd failed her. He left the hospital soon after, unable to bear the weight of her absence. The 13th story is from a woman named Hannah, who lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of a forest. She loved the solitude, the peace of the woods, the sound of the wind in the trees. But one night, she was woken by the sound of someone crying outside her window. It was a child's voice, pleading for help. Hannah got up, wrapped herself in a blanket and went to the window. The yard was empty, the moon casting long shadows across the grass. The crying continued, growing louder, more desperate. Hannah opened the door, stepped outside and called out. The crying stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so deep it felt unnatural. She stood there shivering until the first light of dawn. She never heard crying again, but she never forgot the feeling of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the edge of the light. These stories are a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, that sometimes the most ordinary places can become the setting for something extraordinary. A cry for help at 3 a.m. is never just a sound. It's a question, a challenge, a door that opens onto the unknown. And once you've heard it, you can never quite go back to the way things were before. There's a thread that runs through all these stories, a sense of unfinished business, of voices reaching out from the dark, hoping to be heard. Sometimes the cry for help is a warning. Sometimes it's a memory that refuses to fade. And sometimes it's a test, a way of asking whether we're willing to listen, even when it's easier to turn away. The 14th story comes from a man named Victor, who worked as a night watchman at a museum. The building was old, filled with artifacts from distant times and places, each one carrying its own history, its own secrets. Victor liked the quiet, the sense of being surrounded by stories. But there was one night that changed the way he saw the world. It was just after 3 a.m., and Victor was making his rounds, flashlight in hand, when he heard a voice echoing through the marble halls. It was a child's voice, soft and pleading, calling for help. He followed the sound, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor, until he reached the Egyptian exhibit. The voice seemed to be coming from inside a display case, a case that held a small, ancient doll, its features worn smooth by time. Victor stood there, heart pounding, listening as the voice faded into silence. He checked the security cameras, but saw nothing unusual. The next night, the voice came again, always at 3 a.m., always from the same spot. He started to wonder if the doll was haunted, if it carried the spirit of a child who had been lost long ago. He tried to ignore the voice, but it grew louder, more insistent, until he could no longer pretend it wasn't real. One night, he placed a small toy next to the doll, a gesture of comfort. The voice never came again, but Victor always felt a sense of peace in the museum after that, as if a restless spirit had finally found rest. The 15th story is from a woman named Tessa, who worked as a dispatcher for emergency services. She was used to the sound of panic, the rush of adrenaline that came with every call. But there was one call she could never forget. It was 3:01 a.m. when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was a child, crying, begging for help. "Please, my mummy won't wake up." Tessa tried to get the address, but the child was too young, too scared to give clear directions. The call was traced to a payphone near an abandoned building on the edge of town. Police arrived within minutes, but found nothing. No child, no sign of anyone in distress. The payphone was old, covered in graffiti, the receiver hanging loose. Tessa listened to the recording of the call over and over, trying to find a clue, a detail she'd missed. But the voice was always the same, frantic, pleading, and then gone. For weeks afterward, Tessa had trouble sleeping. She started to dread the sound of the phone ringing in the middle of the night, afraid she'd hear that voice again. She never did, but she never forgot the feeling of helplessness, the sense that someone out there had needed her, and she'd been unable to help. The 16th story is from a man named Daniel, who lived in a small town surrounded by woods. He was a skeptic, a man of science, who believed that every mystery had a rational explanation. But one night, his beliefs were put to the test. It was just after 3 a.m. when he was woken by the sound of someone knocking on his door. He got up, annoyed, and went to the window. Standing on the porch was a little girl, her hair tangled, her dress torn. She was crying, begging for help. Daniel hesitated, unsure what to do. He opened the door, but as soon as he did, the girl vanished, leaving only a puddle of water on the porch. He searched the yard, the woods, but found nothing. The next morning, he asked his neighbors if they'd seen anything unusual, but no one had. He tried to convince himself it was a dream, a trick of the mind. But every night after that, at exactly 3 a.m., he heard the sound of crying outside his window. He never opened the door again, but he never forgot the look in the girl's eyes, or the feeling that he'd failed a test he didn't understand. The 17th story is from a woman named Angela, who worked as a night nurse in a children's hospital. The job was demanding, the nights long, but Angela loved the work, the chance to bring comfort to children in pain. But there was one patient she could never forget, a little boy named Max, who was dying of leukemia. Max was brave, always smiling, always trying to make the other children laugh. But as his illness progressed, he became more withdrawn, his eyes fixed on the window, as if watching for something only he could see. One night, just after 3 a.m., Angela heard Max crying for help. She rushed to his room, found him sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face. "He's here," Max whispered. "He wants me to go with him." Angela sat with him, holding his hand, trying to comfort him. Max calmed down, but he never took his eyes off the window. He died the next night, just after 3 a.m. Afterward, Angela asked the other nurses if they'd ever heard crying in the hospital at night. They all said the same thing. Sometimes, just before a child passes, they hear a voice calling for help somewhere down the hall. These stories are a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, that sometimes the most ordinary places can become the setting for something extraordinary. A cry for help at 3 a.m. is never just a sound. It's a question, a challenge, a door that opens onto the unknown. And once you've heard it, you can never quite go back to the way things were before. There's a weight to these stories, a sense that every unanswered cry leaves a mark, a ripple that spreads through time and memory. For some, the experience is haunting, an echo that never quite fades. For others, it's a lesson, a reminder that compassion and fear often walk hand in hand, especially in the quietest hours of the night. The 18th story comes from a woman named Rosa, who worked as a caretaker in an old Victorian mansion that had been converted into a bed and breakfast. The house was beautiful, but carried a reputation for being haunted. Guests often reported strange noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Rosa, practical and unflappable, dismissed most of it as overactive imaginations, until one night, when she was the only staff member on duty. It was just after 3 a.m. when she heard a child's voice echoing down the grand staircase, calling for help. The sound was so clear, so desperate, that Rosa didn't hesitate. She grabbed her flashlight and followed the voice up to the 3rd floor, where the oldest guest rooms were located. The hallway was dark, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and lavender. The voice led her to the end of the hall, to a room that hadn't been used in years. The door was slightly ajar. Rosa pushed it open, her heart pounding. The room was empty, the furniture covered in white sheets, dust motes swirling in the beam of her flashlight. The crying stopped as soon as she entered, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. On the windowsill, she found a small dusty toy, a wooden horse, its paint chipped and faded. She picked it up, and for a moment she thought she heard a sigh, soft and relieved. Rosa placed the toy on the mantel in the main hallway, a silent offering. The crying never returned, and the guests who stayed in that room afterward reported nothing but peaceful dreams. Rosa never doubted the stories again, and she always made sure to listen, just in case another voice needed to be heard. The 19th story is from a man named Caleb, who worked as a night shift operator at a remote radio station. The job was lonely, the hours long, but Caleb enjoyed the solitude, the chance to play his favorite music and talk to the occasional insomniac caller. But there was one night that changed everything. It was a slow night, the phone lines quiet, when Caleb heard a faint voice coming through the static between songs. At first he thought it was interference, but the voice grew clearer, a child's voice, crying for help. "Please, can anyone hear me?" The voice repeated over and over, growing more desperate with each plea. Caleb tried to respond, but the equipment only produced more static. He checked the phone lines, the transmitter, everything he could think of, but the voice persisted. He played a song, hoping the sound would drown it out, but the crying continued, weaving through the music like a thread. He called the station manager, who told him to ignore it, said it was probably a prank or a technical glitch. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was real, that someone out there was reaching out, hoping to be heard. He stayed at the station until dawn, listening, waiting, but the voice never returned. For weeks afterward, Caleb found himself listening for the sound, hoping for a chance to help, to answer a call that had gone unanswered for too long. He never heard the voice again, but he never forgot the sense of responsibility, the feeling that sometimes the only thing standing between hope and despair is a single, listening ear. The 20th story is from a woman named Mia, who worked as a night shift cleaner at a hospital. The job was thankless, the hours brutal, but Mia took pride in her work, in the quiet order she brought to the chaos of the day. But there was one night that left her changed forever. It was just after 3 a.m. when Mia heard a child's voice echoing through the empty corridors, calling for help. She followed the sound, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum until she reached the pediatric ward. The lights were dim, the rooms empty, but the crying continued, growing louder, more urgent. Mia checked every room, but found nothing. The crying led her to the playroom, where she found a single balloon drifting near the ceiling. The crying stopped as soon as she entered, replaced by a feeling of overwhelming sadness. Mia sat down, her back against the wall, and whispered a prayer for the child, whoever they were. The next morning, she found a thank you note taped to her locker, written in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for listening." Mia never found out who left the note, but she never forgot the lesson. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply listen, to be present, to acknowledge the pain of another, even if you can't fix it. These stories, woven together by the thread of a single hour, remind us that the world is full of mysteries, that compassion and fear are often two sides of the same coin. A cry for help at 3 a.m. is never just a sound, it's a call to action, a test of our willingness to reach out, to listen, to care. And once you've heard it, you're changed, marked by the knowledge that sometimes the only thing standing between hope and despair is a single, listening heart. If you've made it this far, maybe you're wondering what you would do if you heard a cry for help at 3 a.m. Would you answer? Would you turn away? Would you convince yourself it was just a dream, or would you risk the unknown, step into the darkness and listen? The truth is, none of us really know until the moment comes. But these stories, real, raw, and unforgettable, remind us that the world is full of voices, some living, some lost, all longing to be heard. Maybe the next time you find yourself awake in the small hours, when the world is silent and the shadows seem to move just out of sight, you'll remember these stories. Maybe you'll listen a little more closely, pay attention to the things that go bump in the night, the whispers that drift through the walls, the cries that echo in the spaces between sleep and waking. Maybe you'll realize that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be present, to offer a moment of kindness, a word of comfort, a listening ear. Because in the end, that's what these stories are really about. Not just fear, not just mystery, but connection. The fragile, powerful thread that binds us all, even in the darkest hours. Never ignore a cry for help at 3 a.m. You never know whose life you might touch, or how your own might be changed in return. Thank you for listening. And if you ever hear a voice in the night, remember, you are not alone.